Okay, basically I'm going to preach at you tonight because, frankly, we are living in what's been known or described as the sixth extinction, which for whatever reason the joys of the cybernetic world. We have the lights again so we can play with the computer. All right, and let's hope that we've got, that this is working the way it ought to be. It was working not so long ago, and it is on.
There you go.
All right, we're in business. All right, lights again. Okay, we're living in what's been described as the sixth extinction, where we're looking at human impact on the living world, and some of the poster children of this are pretty obvious. The polar bear is not doing terribly well as the Arctic ice melts. We had a year of the frog a couple of years ago because of a really serious loss of amphibians due to an invasive and very toxic fungal infection. Reptiles are in trouble. Lots of birds are because of habitat loss. And these animals tend to get the coverage. There's been some very good nature programs focusing on these animals because they're terrestrial animals. They live in the same environment that we do. But the unsung victims of the sixth extinction are fish. They tend to be out of sight, out of mind, but they have been negatively impacted to a far greater extent than any other group of vertebrate animals. The reason for that is quite simple. They live in a very fragile environment. This is somewhat out of date. I put this together in 2016. I suspect if I were to do it today, the red bars would be considerably larger, particularly for North America and for Europe. Fish are in trouble. And the reason freshwater fish are in trouble is very simple. We supposedly live on the water planet. 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered by water. But the overwhelming majority of that water is salt water. The total amount of fresh water in the global world budget is something like 2.5%. And to put this in perspective, if all the world's water were the content of a bathtub, the total amount of fresh water would be 1 tablespoonful. Now, of that fresh water, most of that is tied up in ice and snow. If we're talking about freestanding fresh water, which is the water that fish live in, it's also the water that we drink and that we need to grow our crops, that is 1/2 of 1% of the total world water supply. So this is a very limited resource, and it makes for very limited habitats. There are any number of threats that are focused on fish because of that reason. The first is what I call water wars. As I said, that same minute percentage of freestanding fresh water that fish live in, we also need for our activities. And the place where water wars are most obvious are deserts, because a desert is a place where, by definition, water is in short supply. And we're going to focus this primarily on northern Mexico and southwestern United States. That's the desert habitat that I'm most familiar with. Well, as I say, deserts are places where water is in short supply, but every desert has its oases. These are standing bodies of fresh water that are usually fed by artesian springs. They're very interesting habitats, and they tend to support an interesting fish fauna. As I say, the problem with the desert, it's a place where water is in short supply. And when people come into competition with wildlife for water, it's not usually the wildlife that wins. So, for example, you see what looks like really conspicuous use of water. This is the fountain in the municipal plaza in the city of Monterrey in Mexico. Spraying water in the air in a dry climate is not usually the most efficient way to use it. But the real problem in desert habitats is the use of water for irrigation, because this requires far more water than you would use just to run a municipal fountain. And pivot post irrigation has become extraordinarily widespread in desert habitats. As I say, oases are interesting, but they're fragile. It doesn't take very much in terms of messing around with the groundwater to make an oasis uninhabitable for fish or any other kind of wildlife. The poster child for oasis habitats in northern Mexico is Cuatro Ciénegas. This is an internal valley, isolated valley from the rest of the other drainages. It's basically, if you can imagine, a continental Galapagos, because when you cross the sill, and go down the pass in Cuatro Ciénegas, everything is endemic. The cactuses, a lot of the insects, the reptiles, the fish. It's an absolutely amazing place. And the only reason it's still in reasonably good shape is that a lot of the water that comes out of the ground is so heavily mineralized, you can't grow anything with it. The difficulty, however, is that all of this aquifer is dependent on water that flows downhill or down north to south. And the adjacent valley immediately to the north of Cuatro Ciénegas has been pumping fresh water out of that aquifer to grow crops. And we're starting to have a detectable effect on the quality of habitats within Cuatro Ciénegas proper. These 3 species are endemic. They're found there and nowhere else. And in the worst case, when uncontrolled extraction of groundwater is allowed to proceed for any length of time, you lose the habitat. This was a lovely habitat, the Matinal de El Potosí. This was the highest altitude habitat where you had desert pupfish. And when I visited it in 1979, it looked like this. Artesian springs supporting lovely standing water habitats. The local people were diverting that water sustainably to grow their own food crops. It was a paradise. It was home to 2 endemic pupfish, Cyprinodon alvarezi and Megupsilon aporus. When I visited in 1992, it looked like this. Basically, a big Mexican agribusiness company had come in by waving a large wad of money in the direction of the town council. They were allowed to drill borehole wells, totally illegally, I might add. You theoretically, to drill a well in Mexico, you have to have 3 separate ministries sign off on it. And if you have ever had the joy of dealing with the Mexican government, you would assume that there has been no wells dug in Mexico for the last 50 years. However, unfortunately, in Mexico, if you wave a large enough wad of money in the right places, you can do anything and nobody says boo. And this is what happened in this particular case. We still have Cyprinodon alvarezi. We were lucky enough to get it under culture, and there's a captive population. Unfortunately, we were not as successful with Megupsilon aporus. We've lost that animal. It's now extinct. The fish that are at risk in Mexico, virtually all the Gudeiid species, the split-fin live-bearers, are to a greater or lesser extent threatened, and a number of them are actually extinct in the wild and exist only in the aquarium hobby. There are a number of cichlid species that live in very restricted habitats that are, again, very vulnerable to this kind of hydrological disruption. And there are a number of killies in addition to the pupfish. Lucania interioris is a little endemic killie found in Cuatro Ciénegas. We now move to a part of the world where water is not the limiting resource, and the threat here is export-oriented commercial agriculture. And the first place we'll look at is Central America. And the principal enemy of freshwater fish in Central America is the banana. Now, why is that? Well, generally speaking, if you want to make money with tropical agriculture, you take a plant that produces something desirable, you find a part of the world a long distance away in the same climatic zone, and you grow it there. And you do that because in doing that, you escape all of the pests that have evolved to that particular food plant or crop. So we don't grow coffee commercially in Ethiopia, where it comes from. We grow it in Brazil. And we don't grow rubber commercially in Brazil, where it comes from. We do it in either West Africa or we do it in Southeast Asia. Well, theoretically, we should have no problems growing bananas in the New World, because bananas are not native to the New World. Bananas are originally from New Guinea. The problem, unfortunately, is that there is a family of plants in the New World, the heliconiids, and these are we having a dissident moment? Yes, we seem to be. This is a very diverse family of very colorful plants. Heliconiids figure quite prominently in the cut flower trade. The problem is they are so closely related to bananas a lot of the diseases and pests that give them a problem can make the jump to bananas. So the only way you can grow bananas commercially in Central America is through the use of massive inputs of some appallingly toxic agrochemicals. And what happens, of course, is that that chemical is sprayed on the field, and then it rains, and it washes into the adjacent stream. And it pretty much wipes out everything else that lives in that body of water. And you can always tell in Costa Rica and in Panama whether you're dealing with a situation where you've had wash-in with agrochemicals, because the only animals you'll see swimming around in the stream are Buffomarinus tadpoles. Because basically the cane toad seeks out habitats with no fish in them to lay their eggs. And believe me, banana culture in Central America, it's not particularly romantic. It's not, quaintly dressed colored people with bananas on their heads taking them to the boat. It's about as romantic as growing soybeans in Iowa. The fish that are impacted by this in Costa Rica, there's one river, the Rio Sixaola, which is the frontier between Costa Rica and Panama on the Atlantic slope. These are 4 endemic cichlids that are found there and nowhere else, or actually just a little bit to the south in Panama as well, which has also been impacted by bananas. When I first visited the Sixaola, the entire drainage basin was banana free. And in a relatively short space of time, bananas moved into this area. They were grown as high up as you can grow bananas. And in the process, effectively, we lost all 4 of these species in the Sixaola. Now, happily for them, all 4 of them have been brought out as aquarium fish. So these animals are being maintained by aquarium hobbyists. They're being commercially bred in Florida. They're not globally extinct. They're just gone from their habitat in nature. And the irony of this is that within a relatively short time after the banana plantations moved in, the very disease that they moved in to escape from followed them, and the banana farming collapsed. So now it's gone, and there's theoretically no reason why we can't reintroduce a lot of these fish into the Sixaola, and there's tentative pilot projects have been started along those lines. But so just remember, when you pick up those Chiquita bananas in the supermarket, the second place where we're having a real problem with commercial agriculture impacting fish is Southeast Asia. And the problem there is not bananas, the problem there is oil palm. Oil palm is native to West Africa, and there seems to be an insatiable demand worldwide for palm oil. It's used in everything from industrial lubricants to making margarine to making any kind of snack foods. And unfortunately, the climate in most of Southeast Asia is optimal for producing oil palms. So there's a tremendous economic incentive for cutting down native forests, and in particular for draining what's called a peat swamp forest. And the problem with that is that the peat swamp forest is home to an awful lot of neat little fish that we keep in our aquariums. And a lot of these fish are what we call microendemics. They're known to occur one place and one place only. So when you drain that peat swamp to put in your oil palm plantation, and that habitat goes away, so does the fish. The little what I call the eye strainer asboras, sundadanios, little Petacyprus progenetica, which is the smallest living vertebrate fish, ripe female is 8 millimeters standard length. And again, they are absolutely dependent on this peat swamp habitat. When it goes, so do they. And the other fish that are impacted by this are a lot of the labyrinth fish. All the little licorice gouramis are peat swamp fish. And some of these animals literally are known for only one such habitat. So when you lose that habitat, you lose the fish. A lot of species bettas likewise, and so are some of the chocolate gourami relatives. And again, I wish I could give you some good news on this front, but particularly the Indonesians just seem to be absolutely fixated on putting as much of their habitat into oil palms as they possibly can. And I really wonder whether any of these fish are going to have any kind of future in the wild at all. Invasive exotics. This is something that we have become somewhat sensitized to in the United States since we've had to deal with Asian carp in the Mississippi Basin. But the poster child for invasive exotics is Lake Victoria. The aboriginal fishery in Lake Victoria was based on a native tilapia, Oreochromis esculentus, the ngege. And at the turn of the 20th century, when the British were in the process of building a railroad from the coast to Entebbe, they had to feed their workers. And they first thought they could do this by shooting game. Well, that proved to be unsustainable. Then someone said, well, you know, we've got this big lake and the people are fishing, but they're not using terribly efficient methods. They're using fish traps and spears and whatever. So let's introduce gill nets, which they did. And as far as the local fishermen were concerned, this was the greatest thing since sliced bread, because a gill net is a low work fishery. You just basically set the net at night, come back in the morning, and if God is kind to you, it's full of fish. The problem with gill nets is they're what we call size-specific gear. They will catch a certain size fish relative to the size of the mesh of the net. And what typically happens is in a very short space of time, you will catch all of the larger fish that you can catch in a large mesh net. And the universal fisherman response to this is to make the meshes smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually you catch the fish before they're old enough to breed and the fishery collapses. And this is exactly what happened in Lake Victoria. Basically the pink bar indicates the number of fish per net per night, and you can see over time it declined pretty dramatically. Effectively, by the late 1940s and early 1950s, for all practical intents and purposes, the commercial fishery had collapsed completely. Well, what are you going to do? Basically, this fishery fed not only the people living around the lake, but because these tilapia was sun-dried, they were feeding people in all three riparian countries, Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, for distances of up to 300 miles away from the lake. Well, the first thought was, let's see, maybe we can introduce another tilapia species that will fill the gap. So they tried Nile tilapia, they tried the black night tilapia, Oreochromis leucostictus. They tried two coptodon species, Zilli and Rendeli. All four of those tilapia established themselves, but they never built populations that were large enough to make up for the lost ngege. Then someone got the bright idea, well, you know, this lake is full of little useless Haplochromines. Why don't we put in a predatory fish that will convert all the Haplochromous biomass into catchable fish? So they decided, let's try the Nile perch. That was what was suggested. The idea was officially turned down because, as someone quite correctly pointed out, tilapia are a lot lower on the food pyramid than Nile perch. If you want to maximize your fisheries output, you want to build up the tilapia population. And Nile perch are equal opportunity predators. If they can fit it in their mouth, they will eat it. The initial introduction of Nile perch was unofficially sanctioned. It was done in the late 1950s. And initially, it did not seem to be a particularly successful exercise. Clearly, Nile perch were breeding because they were catching young ones, but not in large numbers. In the late or the mid-1980s, something happened to change that. And all of a sudden, we went from a fish fauna that was dominated numerically by Haplochromine cichlids to one that's dominated numerically by a single species, the Nile perch. Now, from a commercial standpoint, this was a roaring success. The Nile perch became the basis of an extremely profitable export fishery, not fish to feed the local people, but fish to export to the Far East and the Near East and to Europe. But from the standpoint of the local fishery, it was a bust. And from the standpoint of the endemic Haplochromines, it was an absolute disaster. By conservative estimate, we have lost 350 Haplochromine species. This is out of a projected fish fauna of about 600 fish. This is the largest single vertebrate extinction since the terminal Cretaceous event that made the world safe from dinosaurs. Some groups were very negatively affected, the predators and the pedophages, but basically it was an equal opportunity food fest for the Nile perch. These are four species that no longer exist in nature, but that were lucky enough to either be exported as aquarium fish or being studied in laboratories for other purposes, and they survived the Holocaust. The other problem facing freshwater fish is dam construction. A dam profoundly changes the nature of a body of water. It changes it from flowing water to standing water. And that has a really dramatic effect on the composition of the fish that live there. I was involved as a Peace Corps volunteer in doing some follow-up work in Lake Volta which was the result of the damming of the Volta River at the Akosombo Gorge to generate electricity. And this is a case where we had a very accurate picture of the fish that were being caught commercially before that dam was built. And essentially the dominant species at that time were Heterodus niloticus, the Nile arowana relative in West Africa, and a whole bunch of catfish and cyprinids and characins. Tilapia were being caught, but they were not a dominant element in the fish fauna. Within 2 years after the dam was closed, the Heterodus dropped out of the picture almost completely. So did most of the Asteriophycins. 2 catfish remained. And the tilapia population exploded. Now, from the standpoint, again, of the fishery and from the standpoint of Ghana's economy, this was a very desirable turn of events. And since all of the fish that were no longer being caught commercially simply moved up beyond the lake and was still present in the Volta, it wasn't a particularly disastrous event from the standpoint of losing biodiversity. But it's a nice example, it's a textbook example of what happens when you turn a body of running water into a body of standing water. The 20th century will probably go down in history as the century of dam construction. Basically, we figured out how to do it efficiently, and we've been doing it with great enthusiasm ever since then. These dams are usually built for power generation. A lot of them are for flood control. Some of them are to provide irrigation water. The 3 river basins that have been most dramatically impacted by dams and continue to do so are the Congo River in Central Africa, the Mekong in Southeast Asia, and the Amazon. And as you can see, the Amazon in particular, if the Brazilians are allowed to go through with everything that they want to do, is going to be profoundly changed in terms of its nature if all of these dams are built. And the area where, and as you can see, this is not going to have a positive effect on fish fauna. The red indicates the number of species that are endemic to a particular body of water, and the Amazon is an extraordinarily speciose body of water, as those of us who keep aquarium fish are well aware. So we're talking about a tremendous number of animals that are going to be very negatively impacted if these projects go through. The area that's really being pounded are what I call the south bank tributaries of the Amazon, rivers like the Xingu and the Tapajos. And the irony of this is that most of these dams are not long-term propositions. They will silt up very rapidly, and once they silt up, they're no longer useful as a source of hydroelectricity. Now, the fish that will be most immediately impacted by dam construction are migratory species. These are animals that either have to move upstream or downstream to spawn, and when you stick a physical barrier across the river, that's the end of the migration, or the piracema, as it's called in Brazil. So the really big predatory catfish, like the dorado, and for that matter, a lot of tetras are upstream migrants to find their spawning sites. So basically, once those dams go up, that's the end of that. That not only are those fish going to be dramatically impacted, but so are the fisheries that depend upon them. Now, as I say, there are winners and losers when you build a dam. And species that do well in still water, a lot of the pimelotid catfish, quite a few cichlids, will probably do quite well in these artificial impoundments. But there's quite a number of fish that are definitely not going to do well. Any species that is adapted to live in rapids, like a lot of the really colorful loricaria catfish we've had in the hobby over the last 10 years. These are obligate rapids dwellers, and when the rapids go away, so do the fish. There are a number of cichlids as well, little Teleocicla and Retroculus, strictly fast water fish. So when that habitat goes, you lose them as well. The other fish you lose are the fish that live in all the little tributary creeks that used to flow into that river, but they've now been flooded. They're now submerged in an enormous lake. So there's a whole range of small tetras you're going to lose, a lot of killies, a lot of the catfish, like the various Coreodorus. When the habitat goes, so do the fish. And with the cichlids, there's a whole bunch of very nice dwarf cichlids that we're going to lose as well. And again, I wish I could be positive about this, but I don't get any positive vibes at all from Brazilian colleagues that this dam insanity is going to stop anytime soon. Deforestation. This is something that we tend to think of in terms of the Amazon, and logically this makes sense because basically the Amazon rainforest is the one that's closest to us. It's basically, it's the neighborhood rainforest. But the place where it's been most dramatic and where we have the best data documenting it is West Africa. And the reason for that is that during the colonial era, hardwood forests were considered to be an economic resource. So the colonizing power, either England or France, made very careful surveys of their available forest just to determine what the value of that standing timber was. And those cadastral surveys were carried out on an ongoing basis up to independence. And what you can see has happened is, since the turn of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, West Africa has lost virtually all of its primary forest. Such forest as is left in places in Nigeria is secondary forest. And the only reason that we have any primary forest left at all in Ghana is because some of those forests are basically sacred forests. And they are thought to be inhabited by a class of beings called the Obiidae, which you do not want to piss off. And that's basically the only reason those forests have not been cut down. Essentially, this is what happens when you start this process. What is a nice shaded creek suddenly has to deal with a situation like that. Now, the fish that are most dramatically impacted when you lose forest cover are killies. They do not do well when the water temperature goes to be too high, so they need the shade. More to the point, what they feed upon are insects that fall into the water from that forest cover. It's what we call invertebrate drift, insect drift. So again, when the habitat changes, you lose the fish. They just go away. There are a whole bunch of other fish that are in very similar situations. It's not just killies. The African butterfly fish is forest dependent. A whole bunch of small tetras and barbs are absolutely forest dependent, and so are a number of catfish. And from my selfish perspective, so are a number of cichlids. These are 4 species that are endemic to southern Nigeria, and I can remember a time, and it wasn't that long ago, where all 4 of those animals were very commonly exported out of Nigeria. That's not the case anymore. You can still find them, but they are no longer sufficiently close to Lagos to make it attractive for a collector to go out and get them. And as one of those species, Hemichromis cristatus, was described scientifically by yours truly, I feel like one of my children has been negatively impacted by this particular process. A more recent problem, which has materialized since the price of gold went to over $1,500 a troy ounce, is intensive panning for gold. And again, I can understand why this happens. If I'm most familiar with this problem in Madagascar. Madagascar is a country where the median family income is $200 a year. If you have the possibility of making 6 times that amount of money by going down to the river with your pan and going after gold dust, the incentive to do that is literally overwhelming. And this is exactly the problem we're up against. And it doesn't require really elaborate equipment to really screw up an aquatic habitat to the point where fish can't live in it anymore. All you need is 1,500 people with pans along 2.5 miles of stream. And what you basically do is you turn a stream from something like that to something like that. And Malagasy fish do not do well in liquid mud. None of these species would survive that, and the fish that are really most negatively impacted are the bedodiids of the genus Rheocles. These are headwaters animals. They have adopted to live in clear water over a firm rocky bottom, and when you turn a body of water from clear water to liquid mud, they're gone. The other problem we have to deal with worldwide is unsustainable fishing. But from our standpoint as aquarists, what has been most destructive within the last 10 years or so has been the misuse of mosquito nets. In virtually every part of the world, there is some kind of fishery based on the use of woven baskets to catch small fish. And this is traditionally the woman's fishery or the child's fishery. And this is a sustainable fishery because the baskets are so coarsely woven that all you catch are the largest adults of that particular species. The juveniles survive, they can grow up, and they're there to harvest the following year. The problem with mosquito nets is that they catch everything, from adults down to newly hatched fry. And the pattern that seems to be emerging in most places where mosquito nets have been made freely available to people as part of an anti-malaria campaign is the mosquito nets hang in the bedroom at night to keep the mosquitoes away, and then they get taken down to the stream during the day and they're used to catch fish. I am most familiar with this particular problem in Madagascar, but it's effectively ubiquitous in sub-Saharan Africa as well. The fish that are impacted in essentially Malawi and Tanganyika, any fish living over open sandy bottoms, because that's the place where those nets are most efficient. In riverine systems like the Zambezi, any small fish that migrate onto the riverine floodplain during the rainy season to spawn. And in Madagascar, the group that have been most negatively impacted by this are the rainbow fish, the Bedodiids. Quite simply, you can wipe out a species using mosquito nets, and you can do it very quickly. And the problem in Madagascar is not only do you have a catastrophic fall in the population numbers, but Malagasy fish breed seasonally. They typically spawn during the rainy season, which coincides with the southern hemisphere summer. So, assuming that we're dealing with 99% efficiency, there are going to be some survivors. The problem is those Bedodiids and those killies are not going to be able to immediately start breeding and building up their numbers. On the other hand, the exotic live bearers in Madagascar, because they produce babies every 29 to 32 days, as long as the water is warm and they have food to eat, they have a reproductive advantage. And very often, by the time the breeding season comes around, the number of swordtails or the number of platies or the number of mosquito fish has increased to the point where there's no possibility at all that the hatchling Bedodiids or killies are going to be able to survive. So what we have seen in the last decade in Madagascar is an almost 100% replacement in some streams of native Bedodiids or killies with introduced live bearers as a result of the mosquito net. And what particularly upsets me in Madagascar is if there had been a little bit of forethought before these were introduced, there's a social mechanism in Madagascar called the DINA. And the DINA is a mutually agreed upon set of sanctions that fall upon a person that carries out an activity the community does not disapprove of. And typically, in the worst case, if you basically get DINA'd, you are not allowed to be buried in your family tomb, which for Malagasy is the worst imaginable thing that can happen. But typically, it's a fairly substantial monetary fine. And because everybody in the community has agreed to the DINA, everybody is watching everybody else, so cheating is effectively impossible. If, as a condition of receiving the mosquito net, everyone had to agree to a DINA with regards to not using it as fishing gear, the problem would never have happened. The problem is the people that were doing public health were not talking to the people that were managing the environment, so we have the situation that we have now. And don't get me wrong, I am not a fan of malaria. My very good friend Jean-Claude Nourissat died of cerebral malaria that he picked up in Madagascar. So no, I am not a fan of the Anopheles mosquito or Plasmodium. But the point is there are ways to approach these problems that do not wreck the environment, and unfortunately in most of sub-Saharan Africa, these ways have not been effectively implemented. Wetlands conversion. This is a worldwide problem. This is not just in the tropics, but this is a problem that we're facing and we have to deal on an ongoing basis in the United States as well. And the area that I will focus on from the standpoint of aquarium fish is Lake Inle in northern Burma. This is a beautiful body of water, and one of the things that has been touted as a touristic charm are the floating gardens. Basically what these people have done is they use old dugout canoes the same way would you use a window box. You fill them up with dirt, you plant your crops, and it's a very productive and efficient way to do truck gardening. The problem is, as the population grows, so do the number of these floating gardens. And as the number of floating gardens increases, the amount of open water available for the fish decreases. And as I say, in the case of this particular body of water, we have 4 very attractive endemic species that are found there and nowhere else. Little Danio micron, Divario auropurpureus, Microrasbora rubescens, and Sabra resplendens. Now, happily for all 4 of these species, again, they have gotten into the aquarium hobby, and they're all being bred in captivity. So it would be sad to lose these animals in the lake, but at least if we did, it wouldn't be global extinction. They would still be around. The fish that are really at risk to habitat loss are annual killies. And the reason for that is the kind of seasonal habitat that they require to survive are the habitats that people tend to regard as totally worthless unless you drain them. And of course, when you drain them, you lose the fish. Virtually all the little annual killies that are found in southeastern Brazil, in the coastal rivers, are very seriously at risk from this problem. And in many cases, we've lost them in the wild because the habitat that they used to live in are now soccer fields or parking lots or housing developments. Finally, global warming is going to impact everything. The example I've chosen to illustrate this are the soda lake cichlids that come from Lake Natron in Tanzania. Lake Natron is a closed basin. Water flows into it, but there's no outlet. And the most of Lake Natron is so highly saline that literally nothing can live in it except microscopic algae. But along the periphery of this lake, there are freshwater springs that bubble up out of the ground, and these springs are home to 3 endemic cichlids, Alcalapia species, soda lake tilapias. Neat little fish. Now, the persistence of this habitat depends on a very careful equilibrium between rainfall and evaporation. If you start messing up the temperature regime, if you start increasing the temperature by a couple of degrees, first of all, you change rainfall patterns. So you're not necessarily going to get as much rain as you did before. And you're also going to dramatically increase the rate of evaporation. And it is very much a question, very much an open question, whether these habitats are going to be around 50 years from now. Because we've already seen changes in both the total amount of rainfall and the incidence of rain in this part of Africa. And again, this is just one small example. If you look at tropical habitats overall, none of these are going to escape the impact of changes in thermal regime and the weather that's going to follow along with it. It's not just polar bears in the Arctic that have to worry about warming. So basically, this exemplifies what we're up against. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature started keeping track of the conservation status of fish back in 1996. And they have an ongoing review process that goes on. It's a useful but not necessarily up-to-date picture of what's really going on, because the IUCN list is a trailing indicator. It's always about 5 years behind what's actually going on, because the evaluation process is very complicated and time-consuming. But as you can see, the number of critically endangered and near-threatened species has literally exploded since the 1990s. And that trend line is not getting any better. So what to do? Well, the ideal thing to do is to basically stop the problem that's threatening the habitat in the first place. In situ conservation is always the preferred approach to take. In some cases, however, the threat is so serious that the only way to preserve any kind of option at all in terms of saving these species is some kind of captive breeding program. And what that typically entails is collecting broodstock in the wild, bringing it into captivity and managing it. And there's no reason that this can't be done. It's a viable strategy. However, it has its limitations. In the case of Lake Victoria, for example, when the Association of Zoos and Aquariums started with its Lake Victoria Species Survival Program, we had 20 species under culture. We now have 9. Some, like Prognathochropus perrieri, are doing very well. We've got robust populations, and there's no reason to anticipate we're going to lose it anytime soon. But on the other hand, this Haplochromines CF goyardi, we lost that within 5 years of starting the program. In the case, same case with the desert pupfish. We still have Cyprinodon veronicae. We lost Longidorsalis. Well, what's going on here? You would think that public aquariums and zoos, which are staffed by professionals who theoretically know what they're doing, and in many cases actually do, would be the ideal place to have these captive breeding programs. The problem, unfortunately, is that zoos and public aquariums have limited resources. And they tend to focus those resources on animals that drive attendance. People do not go to zoos to see desert pupfish and Lake Victoria Haplochromines. They go to zoos to see lions and pandas and colorful birds. So it's not terribly surprising that available resources tend to be focused on those animals. And don't get me wrong, I have nothing against tigers. I am very fond of cats of all sizes. I have nothing against pandas. I have nothing against birds. But the simple fact of the matter is, they are the competitors for the resources needed to preserve the animals that I'm really concerned about. So I have become very disillusioned about the viability of public aquariums and zoos as a venue for captive breeding programs for anything but charismatic megavertebrates. And if you want to see a nice example of this, look at the difference between the Lake Victoria SSP, which is an officially sanctioned program within the AZA, and the success that aquarium hobbyists have had on both sides of the Atlantic with maintaining Lake Victoria cichlids. And I think this graph pretty much says it all. So basically, what can we as aquarium hobbyists do to arrest this very alarming trend? Well, first of all, we can promote the commercial production of species that are at risk. I have said for the last 20 years, if you are a small, colorful tropical freshwater fish whose habitat is at risk, the very best thing that can happen to you is become a popular aquarium fish. Because once you get into commercial production for the aquarium trade, you become the beneficiary of a self-financing captive breeding program. Second thing we can do as serious hobbyists is to participate in informal captive breeding programs. And the CARES program is a classical example of this. That would be the subject of a talk in and of itself. Someday you folks should ask Leslie Dick to come down from Connecticut and explain CARES to you. She does a far better job of it than I could. Thirdly, we as organized hobbyists can financially support conservation efforts in the field. It doesn't require a great deal of money to accomplish an awful lot of conservation in some of these third world countries. The American Cichlid Association, for example, has the Loiselle Conservation Fund, and we are very actively involved with conservation work in Madagascar, and I would suspect this year we'll be starting some work in Costa Rica as well. The Stewart Grant Fund focuses on Lake Malawi. The American Rainbow Fish Association has provided financial support for a reintroduction effort for an endangered rainbow fish in Australia. The Godiad group is very actively involved in supporting in situ conservation in Mexico. There's a lot of places where a couple $100 can make a big difference. And particularly if you are a 501c3 organization, you have tax-exempt status, at some point the IRS is going to look at you and ask you what you are doing as a charitable organization. So at some point you're going to have to give some serious thought to giving some money away. This is not a bad place to give it away. So just give it some thought, folks. And finally, become politically involved. Find yourself an NGO or an advocacy group that supports the kind of conservation work that preserves wetlands and aquatic habitats, and support it. And don't be shy about letting your elected representative know how you feel about some of these subjects. They do listen to their phone calls, they do look at their emails, and it does make a difference. And frankly, the aquarium hobby has had some notable successes. Most people do not appreciate the fact that the white cloud mountainfish is a critically endangered species. There are only 2 known populations left in the wild in China. Now, it would be sad if that fish disappeared in the wild. It would not be a tragedy, because there are more white clouds produced for the aquarium trade in any given year than I suspect ever existed in the water in southern China throughout the entire evolutionary history of the animal. Another example of this, Divariopathurana, one of the prettiest Danio species. This animal is restricted to a very small patch of habitat in Sri Lanka. That habitat is not protected. Someone in the Sri Lankan Ministry of Environment realized this and made breeding stock of this animal available to a commercial breeder in Sri Lanka, figuring that this was basically the insurance policy against global extinction. And it's worked. Divariopathurana is now regularly available as an aquarium fish. As it is one of the prettiest of the larger Danios, I would say its future, at least as an aquarium fish, is probably assured. Madagascar rainbow, another example of an animal that was brought into the hobby in the 1950s. People are always concerned when you talk about captive breeding, well, we'll lose the genetic integrity of the species. Well, the Bedodia madagascariensis demonstrates that this is not always a problem. We know exactly how many founders were brought from Madagascar to France in the 1950s. 12 pair. And we know where they came from. I was able to collect wild stock from that habitat a few years ago, and John Sparks and Leo Smith at the American Museum looked at the genetics of the captive population and the wild stock. Absolutely no difference. All the rare alleles were still there. The proportions were still the same. Well, the reason for that is that when you are producing several 100,000 of these animals a year, you're not going to have to worry about loss of genetic diversity because of sampling error. You've basically bred up a large enough population that you're going to still keep the genetic diversity of that stock you had originally. So that is a red herring. Captive breeding doesn't work because we produce an animal that's inbred. Finally, a number of the gudeids. Amica splendens, the butterfly gudeid, a pretty fish, but it don't exist anymore in Mexico. It's gone. But it's doing very well in captivity, and there is every probability that within the next couple of years we might be able to reintroduce it into protected habitats in Mexico. So yes, the aquarium hobby can make a difference. So the better people have come up with a little tagline, which I've stolen for my purposes. Because again, a lot of the species betters are very fragile with regards to environmental limitation. And what their mantra is, no one person can save them all, but each of us can save one. This is mine. This is a Pachypanchak species I discovered in Madagascar. It's critically endangered. I've been maintaining it for some years. Basically, all you need for these guys is a planted 15-gallon tank and a supply of food. If you have both sexes, you get babies whether you want them or not. So if every one of us, as a serious hobbyist, picked one species at risk, just go to the CARES list and look at the species that are on there, and decided that they were going to devote part of their available tank space to maintaining that on a long-term basis, this would make a tremendous difference in the long run. And as I say, what we're basically doing is we're buying time. We're saving these animals in the hope that at some time in the future, the situation will change to the point where we can put them back. So give it some thought, folks. You can make a difference. On that note, thank you very much, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions you have about the presentation.